Good morning, and hello curators in various time zones. Happy Friday. I'm excited to have the chance to kick off today's sessions with the introduction to the keynote conversation. I'm Mary Kay Lombino. I'm one of the three co-chairs of the AAMC Conference Benefit Committee, along with Chio Ishikawa and Beth Citron. I'm also Deputy Director and Emily Hargroves and Richard B. Fisher Curator at the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center, where I oversee the areas of photography and 20th and 21st century art. I'm joining you today from the Vassar College campus, which is situated on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Wappinger people, the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohegan Indians, the Delaware Nation, as well as the Delaware Lenape tribe, and I strive to honor that relationship. I have the great pleasure of telling you a little bit about our two incredibly accomplished and influential women who've agreed to speak with us on this occasion, day 2 of a packed schedule of sessions of stimulating and relevant topics. In the interest of time, we've excerpted the biographies to just touch on the highlights. And a quick note, after the conversation, I'll be back to help facilitate the Q&A, which will happen at around noon. So for now, I begin with Elizabeth Alexander, who is a decorated poet, educator, memoirist, scholar, and cultural advocate. In 2018, since 2018, Alexander has served as the president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the nation's largest funder in arts and culture and humanities in higher education. In 2020, under Alexander's visionary leadership, the Mellon has pledged to help reimagine the country's approach to monuments and memorials and provide COVID relief to creative professionals across the country. Alexander has held distinguished professorships at Smith College, Columbia University, and Yale University, where she taught for 15 years and chaired the African American Studies Department. She's Chancellor Emeritus of the Academy of American Poets, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, serves on the Pulitzer Prize Board, and co-designed the Art for Justice Fund. Notably, Alexander composed and delivered Praise Song for the Day for the 2009 inauguration of President Barack Obama, and is author or co-author of 14 books. Her book of poems, American Sublime, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry in 2006, and her memoir, The Light of the World, was a finalist for Pulitzer Prize in Biography in 2015. Also joining us is Mabel O. Wilson, the Nancy and George Rupp Professor of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and Professor of African American and African Diasporic Studies at Columbia University, where she also serves as Director for the Institute for Research in African American Studies. Wilson has authored Begin with the Past, Building the National Museum of American History and Culture in 2017, Negro Building, African Americans in the World of Fairs and Museums in 2012, and the volume Race and Modern Architecture, From the Enlightenment to Today in 2020, with Irene Shang and Charles Davis. With her practice Studio And, she's a member of the architectural team that recently completed the Memorial to Enslaved African American Laborers at University of Virginia, about which Holland Cotter from the New York Times wrote, "It feels receptive and usable, a place for things to happen." With that, I invite you both to take it from here and begin the conversation.
Well, hello, Mabel Wilson. It is so good to be with you today.
Same, Elizabeth. And we both got the message. Black shirts, hoop earrings.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a club.
Yes.
It's our club uniform. And certainly I'm so happy to be with all of you out there who, of course, we wish we could see. But we know you're out there and look forward to talking with you at the end of our conversation. Excited also that we decided to do this as a conversation and have spent some time thinking about a lot about what we could productively talk about, what we could learn about each other and each other's work to add to the day.
Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Yeah, and what we can share with our audience. So, and thank you, Mary Kay, for that lovely introduction.
Yes. So I think we should jump right in. And it starts with a question from me to you that I will then answer after you do, which is we were talking about the built environment and the commemorative environment that is around us in a way that sometimes you don't even know it. Certainly, we now, and Mabel especially, thinks about it all the time because that's one of the things that she does. But I think that what is really the power of monuments, memorials, and the built world around us is that it is quotidian. It is what you walk through when you're going about your business, and acts on us in so many interesting ways. So we thought we would go back to childhood. Mabel wanted to ask you about the built environment and commemorative environment and the landscape that you grew up in.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And if we could have the first slide, I'll just say a little bit about that. And I think that's a really important question. I've been thinking a lot about like the ways in which the built environment shapes our perceptions. And we don't always think about that, but it really does. It shapes literally our visuality and how we see the world. And it socializes us, so that sense of memory and how we relate to time often, is something that we develop with as we grow. And so I grew up in coastal New Jersey, yay for all the Jersey folks out there. And I remember as a child going to Asbury Park. It was the community next door. And so on the left, you see, this is a postcard from the 60s. And, it was a resort town and, whose population quadrupled over the summer. And it was very busy and, but as a child, it was very fantastical and phantasmagorical with the lights and the sounds, the smell of the ocean and the cotton candy and popcorn and, the bleeps of the machine. So it really does saturate your sense of memory scale and that, commemorative or, and the way in which we form memory is often about landscape, place, and movement. But I also, recall, that Asbury had a moment of civil uprising in 1970 at that kind of really moment of social upheaval, and it's a very common list of over-policing, access to jobs, housing, and that showed me that this was a landscape also of inequality, right? And it's also associated with that moment. So if I could have the next slide. And so I just wanted to maybe just share photographs. I took these probably around 1990. And at that point, there was a level of disinvestment, particularly in Asbury Park. There was a kind of white business flight as businesses moved into the malls. And so these are kind of a poignant image of a city and a people in terms of how they inhabited the kind of remnants of a kind of 19th century resort city. Next, please. Right, and that sense of place on the left is Convention Hall, and it was quite empty. Failed redevelopment projects abounded. You see the remnants of what might have been that must have been there in the image on the right. And so there was this kind of sense of abandonment, and that is also kind of part of that landscape, which has now been literally redeveloped and has this whole other kind of persona. But these also sort of inform the ways in which we associate place with memory. And the next, please. So these, I think, connect to your like the way in which you've been thinking about place and memory.
Yes, I grew up in Washington, D.C. My family was from New York City, from Harlem, and we moved when I was 2, and that was 1960, almost 2, so 1963. And Washington, D.C. was a, not barely desegregated city. at that particular time. Also a very, very, very Black city, and a city with many Southern Black people who would come from the South. One of the ways that I would sometimes think about that was we lived in a stretch of what is now called Capitol Hill. It was called Southeast at the time. And we grew up in a set of houses. We first lived in Southwest in Capitol Park, which was the first integrated by design housing area in Washington. And then where we lived on Capitol Hill was also an integrated block, which was a very rare thing. And what was always interesting to me was on one side to the left were all white families, to the right were the older houses and all Black families, and we were right in the house in between, in the new house in between, and everything spilled out into the alley in the back. DC is an alley town, so I think that that's also interesting too, because then you have people and children from all four sides, and all kinds of interesting things happen in that alley. And when you would walk, as we often did, my father loved for our family to go on summer walks, DC, boiling hot, after dinner when it cooled down a little bit. And we would walk in the Black direction. And it was fascinating to see, here's a house, all Black folks, and here's a house where people are keeping chickens, and here's a house where the flowers were very different. It wasn't ivy and dogwood and pachysandra. It was red geraniums and different sorts of flowers. And I would notice those things as I walked. And so this further down in that direction is the Emancipation Memorial in Lincoln Park. And it's a park that you can walk around in circles. And so my mother and I used to do exercise walks on that circle. And there's been a great hue and cry about this statue of late, because there are people who don't like the image of the kneeling, newly emancipated slave. They feel like that is an undignified image of a Black person, that Lincoln is exalted, and many people believe that the statue should go. It was unveiled in 1876. If we could go to the next slide, please. Down the park, across from the park, is a statue of the educator Mary McLeod Bethune. And that was put up in 1974 when I would have been 12 years old. I remember it wasn't there, and then it was there. So I think suddenly we have an incredibly interesting conversation happening in this landscape. And it's something I've thought about looking back now. I didn't really think about it at the time. Bethune, an amazing woman whose parents were born enslaved, whose mother earned their freedom when she was born, Bethune, in 1875. Her family was still working the land in order to have further ownership. And by the time she was 9 years old, she was picking 250 pounds of cotton a day. She went on to become an educator, the founder of Bethune-Cookman College, an advisor with a formal position in the government to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and an extraordinary race woman, an extraordinary Negro woman, one of our women, as they would say, right? So already I feel like when we're thinking about, I understand what's problematic about the Douglas the Lincoln statue, if we could go back to that slide. But what I think is fascinating is what happens when you historicize a place. So, when you now have Mary McLeod Bethune for Lincoln to talk to, if you will, when you now have an emancipated slave at that moment of emancipation, and then you have Black children who are always free and in postures of freedom as they play in the statue across the way. This Lincoln statue used to face towards the Capitol, which is, but then they turned it to face it across the park. Someone made a decision that it should face in a different direction. I think, again, to talk to Bethune. And even more fascinating, when this statue, by the way, was paid for by emancipated Black people. That's who paid for the statue. So as I became more and more fascinated and read and learned more, Frederick Douglass gave a speech at the unveiling of this statue. Ulysses S. Grant, his cabinet, the Supreme Court, all of those people were assembled there. And he gave an assessment of Lincoln that was very complex. He praised things worth praising, but he also said at the end of the day, he was a white man and he was a white man's president. And it's a very long and quite amazing speech. I mean, that could be a whole topic of conversation for us here. And he also critiqued the statue. He said, "The Negro hero, though rising, is still on his knees and nude. What I want to see before I die is a monument representing the Negro, not a couchant on his knees like a four-footed mammal, but erect on his feet like a man." So what I think about when I think about this space is, what would it mean to make more of that present in the day-to-day experience of visiting that place, so that today's child like me visiting it all the time could learn something and perhaps not have that feeling of, complex abjection when you look and you think, the white man has clothes, the Black man is naked, the Black man is on his knees, that teaches something. So how can we teach more? And then if we could go to the slide past Bethune, I think that's actually not the one. Do we have yeah, we don't have a slide. If you could, sorry, move back. Let's stay on Lincoln. Thank you. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was built when I was in college. And, DC being such a city of, monumental figures, and even if as a regular resident, as a Black resident, as a child, you move around it on foot. And there are just all of these big stone men in big places. But when the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was built, the way that it explicitly spoke against the figurative, spoke against the singular, spoke against the act of war and the man on a rearing horse to be a representation of celebration. So the deep slash in the ground, no figures, all of those names made by an Asian American woman who was very young at the time, was an extraordinary thing that I think set against the rest of DC was a very important moment. Again, as we continue to look back and revise, what would it mean? Because all of those names are of American service people who lost their lives. But what would it mean if that memorial, or if another memorial also told the story, and I have the numbers, the 3 million Vietnamese people, the 3 million Cambodian and Laotian people, most of them civilians, who died in that war. So I think then finally, I think about the things that don't call themselves monuments, that we make monuments in the environment. So this is not sometimes it's in the built environment, sometimes it's in the natural environment. But for me, in that alley that I mentioned, it was a tree with a little brick fence around it. That was the neighborhood kids' home base, gathering place where we would parlay and figure out and decide what we were going to do and divide ourselves and bring ourselves back together again, where there were performances there because you could stand up on it and you could be on a stage. And it was somewhere one time, we found a dead rat in the alley, and I don't know who touched it. It was not me, but we decided the rat needed a funeral. And of course that had to happen at the tree. And so we made it a site that was sacred. I saw my own children do that. It was just so fascinating to me when they were very little. On a city block in New Haven, there was a tree down the way, and that was the tree. And what I remember about it in particular is that one day, without ceremony, the city cut it down. And the mourning over the stump, that, you know, something had died, something sacred had been taken away, but then watching them re-sanctify the stump over time. So I think there's something even from childhood about our will to make memorial and commemorative spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting in what you kind of, particularly in that last, you know, reminiscence of childhood about the tree, like the ways in which these places are made, but how fragile they can be, you know, which was part of my interest in thinking about a place like Asbury Park, you know, that it's like, it's very ephemeral. It was very fantastical and atmospheric in terms of its memory, and you know, which is different than, you know, bronze and travertine and marble, and the ways in which those are meant to mark time and to exist for more than one generation in a way. And I think this, you know, raises the question, I think, of the next thing that we were going to talk about power, in terms of who kind of gets to mark spaces, and who do they address. And, you know, and I love the way you sort of talked about this dialogue between Lincoln, you know, and Bethune, right? And you know, and the ways in which they sort of spatialize these different narratives, both around both representation and power.
Well, yes, and I think that that's why I was so excited to hear from you about the memorial that you built, because I think that also the question of when people or communities are not present to speak for themselves, when because of these power dynamics, they've been marginalized, because when they haven't been deemed worthy. You know, some of the statistics about, I'm sure you know these, but they're amazing, about who's not represented in American memorials. I mean, they're so much worse than I imagined these numbers than I would be, and also numbers are still being developed, but you know, 77,000 properties. This is a oldish but not irrelevant statistic listed in the National Historic Register, less than 2% explicitly affiliated with African American history, 0.1% Latinx history, even fewer Asian American history. You know, representations of women often go to the mythic, to women who did not ever live, to the Alice in Wonderlands, and the you know, the nymphs and the mermaids, and you know, all of those kinds of figures of women that we see. I'm so sorry, that's a really loud phone. But that women who actually lived in history are almost not represented at all. Out of nearly 150 public historical statues in New York City, only 7 of them honor female leaders, 2 of which are women of color, etc. So could you tell us about the UVA Memorial?
Absolutely, yeah. No, I actually served on a committee with Gonzalo, which is how we met, on the Mayor's Commission on monuments and markers in the city. And those statistics are very real. And then served on the She Built New York to sort of address that. And also think of strategies around the making of memorials that, you know, might even challenge some of the kind of patriarchal dimensions around power and representation and who appears in that landscape. So could we have the next slide, please? The next, please. Will you come back to this, Elizabeth?
Come back to that, yeah.
Okay. Okay, and then the next, please. And the next. And then, yeah, we'll just backtrack to those. Yeah, the Mark Ruffer. Okay, next, please. Okay, yeah.
There we go.
Yeah. And so, and many of you may know, this is the University of Virginia, which was envisioned and designed by Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States, second governor of Virginia, but also plantation owner and someone who owned 600 people over the course of his life. But this was his sort of academical village with 10 pavilions for the faculty, 125 students sort of living, in the lower level of the colonnade. And then at the centerpiece is this rotunda, right, which is this monument to the Enlightenment, right, which is the library. But if you look just to the left, could I have the next slide, please? Is an enslaved woman and child, right? And this was actually from a cartouche from a famous map of Virginia, that was depicting this monument of the state. And here it is, slavery in plain sight, right? And this was a very famous image of it. And this was most likely someone who was caring for the child of a professor. And the professors owned enslaved people who ran things called the hotels, which are eating clubs, owned enslaved people. But the university actually didn't own people. They typically rented them. Could be for a year, could be for a day or a week, which is also very interesting in terms of how we think about enslaved economies and how they worked. Could I have the next, please? So in 2016, I joined a team with Mi-Jin Yoon and Eric Howler, fabulous architects in Boston. Frank Dukes, who is an environmental mediator, who was involved in the removal of the Stonewall Jackson and the Robert E. Lee statues in Charlottesville, and Greg Bleem, a local landscape architect, and Etta Otigbe, who's a Brooklyn-based artist. And so we won this commission to build a memorial at the University of Virginia to remember this enslaved community, which had pretty much been hidden until students around 2010 demanded that the university account for and remember its history of slavery. Because as a student, I never heard anything about this. And it was a tough project in the sense the client had no site and no budget and had no idea of what they wanted to build. And it was important for us to really open up that dialogue, particularly with the Black community in Charlottesville that still referred to the university as the plantation. And so you could see the kind of relationship between that rotunda and the site that we ended up choosing, which is still part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it's an area adjacent to the lawn, which is what it's called, that we believe might have been a provision ground. So it might have been a landscape tended by the enslaved community. Next, please. And so, we were really asked by in our community dialogue that we had to tell the truth for this to have any sense of accountability. That was very important. And they don't know exactly how many people were enslaved who were at the university. They both constructed the buildings, the rotunda, they made the bricks, they cleared the land. And then there was a whole group, about 150 at one time, who were caring for and maintaining the university. So they estimate about 4,000 people between 1817 and 1865 lived and worked at UVA. Most of those we don't know anything about. So we mark them with what we call memory marks. So there are these, they were our unknown unknowns, and that is this kind of genealogical cloud across the surface. Next, please.
Oh, wow.
And then there were about 900 or so records, often from ledgers, work ledgers, or private correspondences. So we have these references, like 3 Negro hands hired around Christmas, or, Sam was a carpenter who, and so, we had about 500 references and about 500 names. Of the names, most of them are only first names. So there are 20 Jacks and 50 Sams and, Jane and, there's a small handful of people who we know first name and last name, including someone named Isabella Gibbons, so I'll get to. So what we decided to do with the 500 sort of mentions, we gave them familial kinship relations, grandmother, mother, son, friend. And so that appears within the cloud. And then we talked about the work as brick masons and woodcutters, laundresses and domestics. There's a fiddler in there. And so we tried to kind of construct a set of social relationships between a population that would have normally just been on a grid on a page. And then the memory marks, which we didn't realize that when it rains, water builds up, and it's sort of like they cry. It's like the wall is crying, like this memory is crying. And so it was just a kind of very poignant moment in trying to sort of piece together the community. Could we have the next slide, please? And so this is Isabella Gibbons on the left. She became a school teacher. Once emancipated, she learned to read and write. She was owned by William Rogers Clark, who was a natural philosopher. He left UVA to go on and found MIT in Boston. And it's believed that Rogers' wife taught Isabella Gibbons how to read and write, which was, in fact, we all know, quite dangerous then. And so after she was emancipated, she became a school teacher and started the Freedman School. And so she's the only one that we have a photograph of, first name, last name, and actually a recollection of slavery. And Eto Otatigbe became interested in these photographs and also the materiality of how stone could have been worked by enslaved craftsmen. And so here's a gravestone at the Daughters of Zion Cemetery. Could we have the next, please? And so that's combined on the exterior as a series of markings. And you see here on the left is Isabella Gibbons' eyes. And I like to call her the witness and the watcher of her community. And the eyes appear and disappear. It's a lenticular effect. So it depends on where you are, where your body is, and also just the mood of the sky and the way the light hits the memorial. So she has a very haunting ghost-like presence in the memorial. Next, please. And there's also a timeline. So that's what people are looking at here. It's across from the wall of names. Next. And that timeline, tries to give an accounting of what happened at UVA, what people were actually doing, those who ran away, but also the violence. There are moments of where we hear about assaults and attacks on women. So it's a difficult history. And at the end is Isabella Gibbons' Remembrance. And I just want to read this because I think it's really powerful. It's, can we forget the crack of the whip, the cowhide, the whipping post, the auction block, the handcuffs, the spaniels, the iron collar, the Negro trading, tearing the young child from the mother's breast as a whelp from a lioness? Have we forgotten that by these horrible cruelty, hundreds of our race have been killed? No, we have not or ever will. And that's what ends the timeline. And she wrote this in a Freedman's Journal in 1867 in response to this belief that white Southerners thought that, their former enslaved, they love us and they regard us with, with great sincerity and adoration. And he said, no, we're not going to forget what happened. So next, please. And so it was very gratifying that it became a site. This is, just after they took the construction fence down. This is White Coats for Black Lives. This was a gathering in remembrance of the murder of George Floyd. So it became a site of Black Lives Matter protests instantly. So this kind of connection with history. And next, please. This will be the last one. And it was important that emerged a descendant community. And that's been quite remarkable. And that's been a really great group that has really taken ownership of this site on university grounds, on what they would refer to as a plantation. The memorial is actually faces northward, and that path to the left is a path toward freedom, where each of those steps marks a year of enslavement there. And so that's been an important outcome that I think is a community that will hold the university accountable for this history.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. Do you know if, well, it could be measured, I guess, if there are tourists who go to see this and go to see Monticello, to sort of be able to have a holistic assessment?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's been Monticello Foundation did really great work, particularly around Sally Hemings and doing the archaeological work to find out where they believe she may have lived. And they have an amazing descendant community that, you know, the designers, we met with them, as well as Montpelier, who's done phenomenal work, which is the home of James Madison. And those descendant groups, you know, this is a community, they're related. And so, you know, when Jefferson passed away, some of the professors purchased his slaves, and they resided at UVA. So some of the descendant community are also part of the descendant community of Monticello. So there are these very interesting, you know, I think this is really a crucible, this area, for really understanding that history and its significance to, you know, the formation of the nation. I think it's a really remarkable commemorative landscape in that regard.
What I think is also so extraordinary, and something I wanted to talk about as well, is thinking about monuments as what I call sites of activation, places where they are there and something happens there. So it's so moving to see that this pretty much instantly became a site of gathering, a site of activation, a site of community, a site of accountability. When you think about how in any campus or any community, the kinds of abbreviations for when you say, you know, meet you at the Oval, or I'll meet you at the Quad, or I'll meet you at, you know, whatever the nicknames are that especially college students give for these spaces. It feels like already, but with a tremendous sense of reverence and understanding, that this is in use. Which is fascinating.
Yeah, and what I love about this was that it was students who held the university accountable for this history continually, and were a really important part, you know, of how this came about in so many ways. And just one other point, you know, which sort of gets back to maybe Frederick Douglass's comment about the figure in the monument of Lincoln at the Emancipation. This was a tough project because we don't know who the slave and population looked like. There may be 7 photographs of people who had been enslaved. We don't know much. We don't know when Isabella Gibbons was born. You know, so the form of the monument around figures, dates, names, is possible with an enslaved community precisely because of the dehumanization, you know, the erasure of identity, you know, that is in the archive. It's an archive of violence and silences. So it made the form and the making of the form, I think, a big challenge for us. And so that's why you see like marks and things that are ephemeral and that disappear, and to sort of recognize that.
Well, and it's like, I don't know, magic isn't the word. It's more than that. It's the water tears. And what's that? Well, I guess there are many weeping icons, that's sort of a trope, but that the material just gave you that, is just crazy. So that there's a kind of embodiment also with that conscious choice to put Isabella's changing eyes.
Yeah.
I mean, that is really, really amazing.
Yeah.
If we could go back to the slide of the Lincoln Memorial, please. So back, and oopsie, all gone slides. Because there's a connecting point there I wanted to talk about. If we go. Okay, I think we had it. Maybe it's later. If we could just go to the next one, but what I wanted to mention about the Lincoln Memorial and this idea of activation is that I think of that as, yes, you know, the humongous stone Abraham Lincoln in that structure, but also, you know, March on Washington, Marian Anderson singing after she wasn't allowed to sing in Constitution Hall, and all of the other kinds of gatherings that have happened there, and the history making that's happened there, that's another part of the conversation with the inanimate. that I think we have to mark. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Mellon's Monuments Project, which is the biggest initiative that we've undertaken, 5 years, $250 million, to think about these very questions we've been talking about and the American commemorative landscape. We will be doing a number of different kinds of things. So some would be to make places like the one that you made in Virginia. Some would be to contextualize existing places. So if you can imagine someone came and found an interesting way to, you know, sort of activate, bring Douglas into Lincoln Park, et cetera, that might be an example of something. Also in the contextualizing, a project that we didn't know about to support, but that I really love is Dustin Klein's projections onto Robert E. Lee in Richmond. There's one of the, you know, zillion Robert E. Lees that there are in this country, statues. And in that community, the choice was not to take it down, but rather projecting Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, John Lewis, it moves through history, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. So there's a whole conversation about, it calls out the white supremacist ideology that Lee practiced, and that is his legacy, and said, okay, Truth, Tubman, here are the people who fought against it. Later in history, John Lewis, here are the people who fought against it. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, here is why this white supremacy continues to be with us, and that it's enacted in many, 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 many ways. But one of the ways it's enacted is with this landscape overpopulated with white supremacist icons. It's teaching somebody something. So I really, really love that. And then if we could go to the next slide, please. In the category of new things, this is Judy Baca's amazing Great Wall in Los Angeles, which is built along a very long, this is a concrete drainage canal that was built to create flood channels by the Army Corps of Engineers, replacing the river with concrete and creating a literal divide between East and West LA and obliterating historic ties between communities. And so what Baca does in this extraordinary mural that goes all the way along there is she tells stories of LA history, the Zoot Suit riots, and so many other important stories that are not represented and told anyplace else in the city. So I think that's very exciting. And then if we could go to the next slide. This is a bridge. She's going to bridge the divide. So that is something that's going to be amazing. The next slide, please. Well, there's our March on Washington. Okay, good. It all comes out in the wash. And then the next one, please. Yeah. And then this is, so still thinking about new ways of commemoration, and this relates to the March on Washington. This is Mark Bradford's piece in the Hirshhorn, and I'm going to read you the name of it. It's called Pickett's Charge. And he was inspired by Paul Thibodeau's 1883 Gettysburg Cyclorama, and it's a panoramic. If you know in the Hirshhorn, of course, there's that space that calls for a sort of diorama that depicts the final charge of the Battle of Gettysburg, and is raising all kinds of really fascinating questions about the politics of military memorials, but also in the early stages of this project. And there's a little tie to it in here. He was very interested in, he was given a program of the March on Washington that showed the women and queer people who were supposed to speak and didn't. And so in the long genesis of this project, and I mention this to say that memorials can take so many different forms. Memorials can be ephemeral. He had an idea that he would have Myrlie Evers, the widow of Charles Evers, that he would bring her to the mall and have her deliver the speech that she should have delivered in 1963 at the march. he ultimately wasn't able to do that. And I think it's just also an example of his fascinating mind and all of the pieces of things that come together. But, you know, I mention it to show the different ways that history making can take place. And we're really excited to see, you know, the sort of infinite possibilities. And another thing that we will occasionally do in the Monuments Project is think about the question of removal, and you know, because some things do have to go. I think that when communities make decisions to do that, it's very powerful. I mean, you know, Mellon is not going to go say this goes, this goes, this goes. This is communities in the way that at the National Cathedral, for example, in Washington, D.C., with their stained glass windows of Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee that were put up in 1950 some. So here we're back in D.C., right? 1950 some. My family came 10 years later. The National Cathedral thought that Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson should be in stained glass in that church. Okay? Wow. Civil War long over, long lost. But that community recently said, wait a minute. And again, going to church, not noticing and not caring, you know, like just all of those ways that we live with things. They said, no, we have to take these down because these are an impediment to worship. And what I loved is that they did not say, you know, you hear all these questions, you know, when you know, Silent Sam, or, you know, when any of these things are taken down, well, you're not going to destroy it. Where are you going to put it? And they said, we're not talking about showing these somewhere else. We're not going to throw them away, but we're going to think about what we need to do first, which is, you know, sanctify the space and get rid of these things that get in the way of that. So, you know, we're really just excited embarking upon this at Mellon because there's so much that can be done and so much potent creativity out there with approaching the question of what would it mean in public space to tell the stories of who we really are.
You know, I'm so excited that you took that on, because I think a lot of people think, oh, you know, they're just these figures in these parks that no one cares about. But when you start digging about who put those up, why, you know, what the power brokering often is, you know, these things are territorializing. They are marking and sending messages in ways, subliminal ways that you don't really, they shape how you think, they shape how you see. And we have to be conscious of that, because that is also contributing to these sort of landscapes of, you know, of intimidation and oppression. And we have to think about, especially the proliferation of Confederate monuments, which I prefer to call them American monuments, because as you say, in the 1950s, Americans put those up, not Confederates. So what is it about our American psyche that seems to think that this is a fundamental value of our nation? And if so, why? And what do we need to do to move beyond that?
That's right. That's right. I mean, in fact, you know, I can't stake a total claim on this, but I mean, almost all of them were built at some distance from the war. I mean, their asses were beat. So right after the war, you know, they're not like resourced to put up monuments to themselves. When you think about it. But it comes at moments where white supremacy by Americans, as you say, is re-articulated and literally set in stone to remind Black people of their supposed inferiority, but also, I think, more dangerously, to remind white people of their alleged superiority. And as America changes and more people immigrate to this country, to teach those people about the order of things that they think is the right one, to give them that American inculcation.
Yeah, that's a fiction. It's a total fiction.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's time for us to hear some questions.
Yeah.
That's great. There are a few questions that have already come in. So I will start with the first one from a participant who says the monument to enslaved laborers is incredible and so very important. Is there a toolkit that you can recommend for obtaining the site, getting city and governmental and community buy-in for projects like this one?
I would say we came into the project in 2016, but it had been, the students made their demands in 2010. So the university had already done an extraordinary amount of work, trying to, excavate, right, and make visible this history. And I think what I appreciated about that group of, they were scholars and community members and students, was they were honest. They had no problem saying this was about white supremacy and what did this cost us. And they didn't say that we're just going to put this thing, slavery, in this box and leave it. They're now looking at the history of Jim Crow in the universe. There's a total, and so I think there's a necessary taking stock, an ability to label, which I think is a reckoning, right? You have to reckon with that truth and recognize it, right? You have to give it names. You have to, and so that's painful, right? That's work. And it's not work that Black populations do by being included. It's work in many cases of white, a group of white faculty and students and administrators that have to also engage in that hard work of understanding these histories. And so I think if a group can go through that, then I think they can be open to sort of making a space that can move forward.
I love that, and I'm thinking about and you and Gonzalo will of course remember this, that when community involvement is fraught. So I'm thinking about the Sims. Dr. Sims, father of gynecology, the statue at 110th Street in East Harlem, J. Marion Sims, who was did awful things, medical procedures, surgeries on enslaved women without anesthesia, a very terrorizing person, and he had this statue in East Harlem of all places. And so the great decision was made to move it, and the great decision was made to replace it with something else. But there was a very, very fraught community process that, had a, I thought, tough outcome. And so I think what's interesting is that there's getting the thing made, but then there's what is the concomitant work in community that does or doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And that is, as you explained in your example as well, it's hard.
Yeah, I think it was important, this is something I've learned from Frank, is to make sure that people feel like they're being heard. Because if they feel like what they said was being heard, they're more willing to buy into, a dialogue. Okay, I've gotten this, I will, and I think we managed to do that incredibly well, particularly on behalf of the university that had a, quite frankly, shitty relationship with the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
And they were very pleased that all of a sudden there was like this dialogue going on that had not happened before, because the Black community felt the university, they're not going to do anything. They're not going to build this. They're not. And then when it was, they were like, wow, like, no, this actually paid. And that's why that community, that descendant group is so vital. Because I think then when it comes down to wages, people getting a fair wage at the university, right? Because those are the descendants that are working in the cafeterias like that, or housing issues. Like, this opens it up to broader political questions about how this is playing out at the moment today.
So in addition to questions, I just want to say there's a ton of positive feedback and so much appreciation for this conversation. And let's see, we do have another question that has to do with the amount of time that something might stay up. So could you share your thoughts on duration and time scale when considering monuments and thinking about monuments in the future? Should these monuments become permanent And is their value a temporary thing?
I would love to say a few words about that. I mean, I think it varies tremendously. It varies tremendously. I think about a lot of interesting projects. Some, the Philadelphia Mural Arts Project had a monuments lab that was also run by Paul Farber and his, yes, amazing people. And they commissioned artists to do monuments in Philadelphia. And I remember scrambling to get to see them because they were about to come down. You know, maybe they were up for 6 months or a year. But the idea was that the city would be in conversation. One of my favorites was in front of, and that these pieces would be in conversation with existing monuments. So there's a statue of Frank Rizzo, you know, which actually has since been taken down by the people, that was very prominently placed in Philadelphia. You know, Frank Rizzo, you know, architect and an actor of and creator and empowerer of a racist police force that caused death, fear, and pain to Black people, Black Philadelphians for generations. And Hank Willis Thomas made a huge looming Afro-pick sculpture with a Black power fist that you know, just like shadowed the Rizzo and started a whole nother conversation. So that was just one thing that I thought was very brilliant. And then it's now, it's somewhere permanent now, but it was there temporarily. I think that sometimes, you know, there was another one, and I'm maybe Mabel, maybe you know the name of the artist. It was where two statue plinths became like speakers' corners. And they were also crucially made accessible so that children, people with disabilities, anyone could make their way up and be the statue. You know, could be atop that stone place. Well, wow, that's a whole interesting thing where all kinds of stuff can happen. So I think there can be a range of things, and I think that also the times change and demand different permanences.
Okay, so I think I might combine two questions that I think are somewhat related here. So one of them has to do with this idea of resistance. Have you experienced government or other resistance in taking down particular statues or monuments? And then, of course, what are your thoughts on what should happen to these statues or monuments when they're removed from the public space? Is there a place for them in museums within a critical context?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, these are public debates. When people ask me about the Confederate, I'm like, take them all down. But in reality, I think these have to be determined by communities, and that people, you know, it all depends. But a lot of times I think people have to come to an understanding and really debate why something should stay or go or be recontextualized. I mean, it's important that we engage in these deliberatory processes for that. An interesting example is the Roosevelt in front of the Natural Museum, right? Which American Museum of Natural History in New York. And that was a long, people just said that's offensive. And it's been going on for years and years. And Decolonize the Space did an amazing series of actions around that. And that came up in the Mayor's Commission. And, you know, I'm like, get rid of this, take it down. And, you know, and I think it was a split vote. And I think the mayor actually voted to keep it. But what was great was that museum took it on and made a documentary about it and a whole exhibit about it. And it educated not only the public, but also the museum community, you know, the people who worked in that. And eventually, you know, the board said, no, I think it's time to move this. But it wasn't instant. I mean, this took years for this to happen. And so I think we have to recognize that a lot of it's about process and people coming to an understanding and having people on the inside as well as, you know, people doing actions on the outside to change.
Yes, that makes me think about also there was a in the president's room, the corporation room at Yale University, where I taught for many years, the big portrait of the founder, Elihu Yale, was at the, that's what you'd expect, was at the end of the big conference table. And you would go in there for, special meetings, committee meetings. It was the president's room. So, usually for me, it was going in to, talk about African-American studies when I chaired that department. You come ready, come with your folders, come as, one of very, 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 very few, tenured people of color on campus. It's like serious business. And so, over the years in that room, many times there is the founder. And one day in the middle of the meeting, I looked up and saw what I had never seen, which was the child, the Black child, chained and coffled in this picture next to the founder. And so and obviously a way art historically that wealth, prestige, import, this was sumptuous, this was property, this was an important man. And so I thought, like, how did I never? I felt very self-lacerating. I thought, it's my goddamn business to notice this. How could I not have noticed this? I felt like I had betrayed my ancestors by not noticing and calling that out in the space. But then I thought, like, these people living with this and doing business in the most important place every single day. What is that saying? But it is the founder of the college, and there is a history to be told. So ultimately what happened, I think, was a very important contextualization. The British Art Center at Yale took it from and did a whole project around it. They interviewed historians. There's, if you Googled it now, you could go and find really interesting interviews, conversations, written materials, just what you would put in a wall text that is different from not even acknowledging the presence of the body of this child, or not the body of this child, this child. So I thought that was a great example of something that should have been recontextualized. And also, by the way, it's a campus. It's a teaching place. It's a place where everyone who goes there, studies there, works there. I mean, the founder is relevant. We can't ignore him away. He built the university. So let's talk about him in all of his complexity. Other things I'm with Mabel about. I mean, I think that there is an excess veneration of these things that, we can't get rid of anything. Well, we get rid of things all the time. And guess what? Also, most of them are bad art. That's another thing too. Like, it's really very few of these statues that are actually of particular visual interest. I don't know. I think that melt it down and make something new is another thought as well.
Okay, I think we have time for at least one more question, and this is an interesting one. A challenge we continue to grapple with is the absence in our archives and our collections of the stories, the photos, historical documents, and the objects relating to marginalized members of our local community. Your decision towards honoring those absences in the UVA Memorial are beautiful and poignant. Can you speak a little bit more about how to exhibit absence and erasure? And I will just add from another question, a topic that's somewhat related, just the idea of how to sort of present these ideas in a context that are illustrative, but at the same time showing absence.
Good question. It's complicated. I mean, I'm still thinking about the encounter with this archive, because I've been working on 18th and in my scholarly stuff, 18th and 19th century histories of slavery and American civic monuments. But to have engaged those letters and ledgers, and I mean, you sense the violence, right, of that erasure just in the archive itself, in the process of history making, in the document. And so it makes you just kind of think about, like, the institutions of libraries and archives and museums and collecting, and the work that does to construct ideas of racial difference. And it's tough. I mean, I co-curate of a show at MoMA right now called Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America. And that was a hard project because the archive of the Architecture and Design Archive at MoMA, the first one in the world to collect, materials of architects and designers, there were no representations of, there are very few representations of Blackness, almost none, and nothing that we could find by Black designers, right? And so that was a useless resource in working on this show, right? And so you have to think about, well, how do you construct a show in an institution that relies on its collection so much for configuring and imaginings when there's nothing there? And it required a different kind of curatorial approach in order to do that work. And a different set of questions to ask our participants in that show, to think about anti-Black racism in the built environment, as well as, the kind of futurity, the possibility of Black space beyond.
Well, and I think in that amazing show, what is one of the interesting paradoxes of, an insufficient archive across a whole Black tradition is that, outsized brilliance in the possibility and in that show, the imagination of futurity, is just like, is amazing. That was the thing that I came away with. So, it doesn't mean that it's good that we, we were not in that particular archive, but I think that the way that artists of color meet that erasure is amazing. And also, I mean, this is, of course, the work of African American studies. The work, if you read Nell Painter's amazing introduction to her biography of Sojourner Truth, which is about how do you write a biography of someone who was so important, but who doesn't have, you can't go to, Harvard, to the, conventional archive for her. Or if you look at Saidiya Hartman's work, of course, and the way that she's thinking about the archives we make, then I think that that's where you find some very, very potent thinking. At Mellon, one of the many projects that I'm so proud and excited of is we're doing a lot of funding of community archives. And so, these are people who are gathered around place, identity, work, and they keep their stuff. And so, and they say we are a we. And so to be able to provide resources to say, okay, here's how you can digitize it, this, that, the other thing, so that it will exist as a permanent record, feels, really very wonderful.
So a couple more questions. The questions just keep flowing in. So I think if it's okay with you two, we can go on just a little bit more with a couple more of those. So let's see, could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between these spaces and memory and their context, whether it's a gallery space, a public park, or in conversation with architecture that surrounds it? How do these different kinds of spaces, how do these different kinds of spaces impact how monuments function spatially? So the question is really about the function of memory within space.
What more could we add to that, Mabel? I feel like that's, it's a great question. It's what we've been talking about all this time, so many different examples in the UVA Memorial, so I'm not, there are so many things that we could add. I don't even know where to start.
Yeah, no, I think, see, that's Anthony. Hi, Anthony. If it's the Anthony Graham, I think it is. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's why, Elizabeth wanted to start with this really great question about our childhood and what we remember in the ways in which space and our experiences of space sort of shape our understanding of so many different things, like about power in race and gender, and and we're absorbing that stuff. I love like my favorite quote from Walter Benjamin's Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, right, is the point where he says, yeah, but then there's this thing called architecture, and it kind of exists in this state of distraction. So it's you're not really aware of it, but it is doing things to you and for you. It's very utilitarian, but it's so fundamental in shaping how we experience space. And it is a nexus of power, determining what gets built where is it's power. And so, I think there is a way in which our experiences are shaped for us by these encounters, whether we are aware of them or not, in our habitus, in our daily, we don't necessarily always go and seek these things out. They're just on our paths, in our daily experiences. And we absorb that in ways that we don't realize. I remember interviewing actually for a commission at Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina. And that church sits adjacent to a park that is in front of the Citadel. And in that is a statue of Calhoun that I think is now removed. And the mayor of Charleston said, that statue used to be much lower, except it was constantly getting pummeled, probably by African-American residents who knew exactly who Calhoun was and didn't like his presence. So then they put it up on this beautiful fluted column way up. So it becomes even more of a kind of sentinel territorializing the space, right? So these things speak, and people know what they mean, and they set the tone for a kind of civic ethos, and we have to be aware of that, I think.
For very diverse communities. So I think that's what's also interesting too, is that we all come with our memories and associations. And there's the didacticism of the monument that, does want you to come away with some piece of knowledge or set of facts. But then there's also the always the slippage with how it interacts with who we are and what we remember.
Thank you both so much. We could probably go on and listen to you for a long, long time, but there's another session after this one. So we're going to wrap it up here. So thanks again, and thanks to all the wonderful questions.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Mabel. It is always, I always learn so much, and
yeah, same.
Filled up by knowing what you're doing and thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, no, this was great fun and really great conversation. So thank you.
Okay, thank you all.